Okay, so I'm gonna try this on my laptop. We're gonna do the entire series of Dewey. We're gonna be covering his art as experience. I've actually got the for my students this textbook here, Philosophies of Art and Beauty, edited by uh, Hofstadter and Kuhns, and so it's actually an extract. So we're not going to get all of the entire work of artist experience, but quite a bit. They put quite a bit of his material in here, um, and so it's an extract. There's a couple chapters they skip, or at least there's one chapter I think they skip, and I'm gonna kind of summarize what's already been summarized here, right? So even given all that, this John Dewey series is probably going to be the longest one in the course. There'll be a couple of videos that are probably optional. You don't need to watch them for understanding, but I'm a bit of a completist. I did a lot of work on this presentation, so I kind of want to work through all of the stuff that I did. We'll be skipping a few things, but as usual, in the description below, there'll be a link to a PDF file of the PowerPoint, and so some of the stuff we skip, you can go check it out and read the full version there. And again, this is a new format. I'm usually doing it on my iPhone. Now I'm doing it on my I'm doing it on my laptop, obviously. And let me know, in the comments, let me know what you think. If you prefer this way or the other way. I think it'll be faster for me to get these done this way. And they'll at least upload faster to YouTube. So that's why I'm trying this sort of experiment out. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in to John Dewey, right? Art as experience. And in this video, we're going to cover the first, I guess, half of his the first chapter of the book, Art as Experience. And the title of the chapter is The Live Creature. So it's a long chapter. So we're going to kind of divide it up into two videos here. And even so, they'll probably be pretty long videos. He really lays out a lot of the theory, his general theory of art in the first chapter. And so we really need to kind of take our time on this. And I'm thinking, I'm looking ahead. The lectures will get shorter and shorter as we progress. We'll actually be able to, knock out maybe a couple chapters per video, right? Okay, but let's go ahead and begin here with the first quote I have from his essay, from his long book, book-long essay, Art as Experience. Okay, so right off the bat, right, for him, he wants us to distinguish between artwork and the product of art, okay? And as a theorist, he wants to sort of set the groundwork right up the front. What exactly does the theorist have to do? If we're making if we're proposing a theory of art and aesthetics, a philosophy of art, what are some of the issues? He's going to delve into more of them as we progress through the reading. But right off the outset, he thinks there's something that really gets in the way of most philosophies of art so far. And by the way, the last series we just got out of was the Nietzsche lectures on Birth of Tragedy. I think that him and Nietzsche are actually kind of on the same page on a lot of this stuff. And some of his criticisms wouldn't really apply to Nietzsche. Be curious to hear what you guys think, and obviously comment on that below. If you're one of my students at UH, write about it in your paper for the final paper. But anyway, so let's read this first quote and see what exactly he's talking about as far as some of the problems or issues that attend to art theory in general. So he writes, by one of the ironic perversities that often attend the course of affairs, the existence of the works of art upon which the formation of an aesthetic theory depends has become an obstruction to theory about them. So in other words, the very existence of works of art, the fact that there are works of art in the world, that's the basis for having art theory. If there were no artworks, we wouldn't have art theory. But the fact that there's this dependence has become an obstruction. Why? Well, for one reason, he says, these works are products that exist externally and physically. So they're objects, right, apart from us. In common conception, the work of art is often identified with the building, book, painting, or statue in its existence, apart from human experience. Since the actual work of art is what the product does with and in experience, the result is not favorable to the understanding. Okay, so what is he saying here? What's the problem with theory, right? It tries to separate the works of art, the products of art, the statue, the book, the painting, from the actual experience of these works. In this sense, I would say that Dewey is on the same page as some of the people we've looked at already this semester in this course, namely Kant and Schopenhauer. You could argue Nietzsche too, but I'm not gonna throw that one out there because it's more obvious, I think, in Kant and Schopenhauer. Remember, for Kant, the beautiful is not a property of a particular object. It's actually the property of the experience, right? So when I say something's beautiful, what it means for Kant is that I get a certain reaction out of it. Similarly for Schopenhauer, right? I look at a work of art and I'm able to see the idea in the Platonic sense, at least how Schopenhauer understands the idea in the Platonic sense. So Dewey's he's on the same page, at least as far as art being an experience, right? And so if you want to understand art as a theorist, you can't separate it from the experience of the works of art. So that last sentence, the actual work of art is what the product does. This is something he kind of glosses over throughout most of the book. We're going to get into more details, I think, towards the end in some of the final lectures on Dewey. But when he talks about an artwork and an art product, he has a distinction, right? The artwork is this experience, okay? So when I'm actually enjoying the piece of music or the painting in the museum, that's the artwork. When I see it and I enjoy it and it's doing its job, you know, as an aesthetic work of art, that experience is the artwork. The actual painting that's sitting there on the wall, the actual written word on the paper in the novel that I might be reading, those are the products of art. But the actual artwork, again, is always tied to experience. So that's one problem with all theory so far, according to Dewey, is that, again, they separate the art products from sort of the experience itself of these products, what Dewey calls the artwork itself. What else? So in addition, he says, the very perfection of some of these products, the prestige they possess because of a long history of unquestioned admiration, creates conventions that get in the way of fresh insight. When an art product once attains classic status, it somehow becomes isolated from the human conditions under which it was brought into being, and from the human consequences it engenders in actual life experience. So, you know, for him, when a work of art like Michelangelo's David, for instance, right, the statue that I'm assuming most of us are familiar with, you know, once that artwork becomes a classic, once we the world in general, the art world, recognizes Michelangelo's David to be a work of artistic genius, right, an artistic masterpiece, that piece has sort of been removed from its original context in life experience. In this case, the statue of Michelangelo's David was originally supposed to be at the top of a church, or maybe a cathedral, but nevertheless, it was supposed to be up very high, and that's why the hands are disproportionate. But eventually, once it was finished, they actually originally unveiled it and kept it in front of the city hall in Florence, and so it was sort of an object of civic pride. And so for Dewey, that is an essential aspect of any piece of art. In this case, Michelangelo's David, the original context, right? Once we remove that piece of art from it, it will cloud our understanding of it. And so any theory that doesn't take that into account is necessarily going to somehow, kind of run off the rails a bit. Okay, so when we look at art and experience together, of course, this is the way we should approach it for Dewey. But according to him, this is not how it's been done so far. But when artistic objects, let me just read the quote, when artistic objects are separated from both the conditions of origin and operation in experience, a wall is built around them that renders almost opaque their general significance, with which aesthetic theory deals. Art is remitted to a separate realm where it is cut off from the association with the materials and aims of every other form of human effort, undergoing, and achievement, right? So for him, this is essential to aesthetic experience, right? That it's always embedded, this is what's essential to aesthetic or artistic experience. It's always embedded in some sort of human effort, undergoing, sense of achievement, accomplishment, overcoming of obstacles. We'll talk more about that, I think, in the second video, right? But in this first video, again, we're still on chapter 1, the live creature. That's the title of the chapter. But in this part, he's kind of talking about, at the outset, some of the difficulties that beset us, right, when we're doing art theory, right? And again, obviously, one of the problems for him is we separate it from its context. We separate it from the culture and the act of creation itself, right? What the intent of the artist, all these things are relevant for him. So one of the tasks, he argues, is to restore continuity, he says, between the refined and intensified forms of experience that are works of art and the everyday events, doings, and sufferings that are universally recognized to constitute experience, okay? So we have to have a general theory of experience, which he's going to get to. Probably in the third video, we'll talk more about that. What is experience, what in general, and how do works of art differ from just universally recognized modes of experience, right? As you see in this quote, there's nothing really new here. He's going to have it. I think once we see his full theory, it's going to take on a new significance. But this notion that art is an intensified form of experience should be nothing new to us. I'm sure there's someone else, but directly in my mind, Schopenhauer is the one that's popping into my head, right? For Schopenhauer, the artistic genius is the one who's able to see something in our everyday experience, but to see the beauty in it, right? To see, for him, the expression of the underlying will trying to express itself as Platonic idea. That's all jargon, right? But basically, we're taking, if you're a painter, you take the colors and you intensify them and you present them to a viewer in a way to which they can see the beauty in it that, maybe they weren't aware of, right? But by sort of taking something more everyday and again, making it more intensified through the work of art. So for him, we can enjoy works of art. It's, we don't have to know all this stuff. If we want to enjoy Michelangelo's David, if we want to enjoy a painting or something like that, we can enjoy it, sure, without understanding the context and all the sort of other things. But that's not theory, right? So if we're doing art theory, for him, that is equivalent to understanding. So that means that we can't divorce these two things. We can't divorce the artwork, the product of art, in his jargon, the product of art. We can't divorce that from the culture from which it sprang, and sort of the artistic intent of the artist. So again, for him, he says it's quite possible to enjoy flowers in their colored form and delicate fragrance without knowing anything about plants theoretically. But if one sets out to understand the flowering of plants, he is committed to finding out something about the interactions of soil, air, water, and sunlight that condition the growth of plants. And so how does this apply to art? Right? We look at a work of art like the Parthenon. Was this really originally a work of art? Dewey might say maybe not. It was aesthetic. But when it was first created, what was the context? So he writes, by common consent, the Parthenon is a great work of art. Yet it has aesthetic standing only as the work becomes an experience for a human being. And if one is to go beyond personal enjoyment into the formation of a theory about that large republic of art of which the building is one member, one has to be willing at some point in his reflections to turn from it to the bustling, arguing, acutely sensitive Athenian citizens, with civic sense identified with a civic religion, of whose experience the temple was an expression, and who built it not as a work of art, but as a civic commemoration, right? So we look at this picture of the Parthenon, right? Beautiful work of art. It's ruins, right? Like it's not complete, but people go there all the time and sort of just look at it with awe, right? How large it was, all the sort of thing. We can enjoy it on that level, right? And that's just sort of this level of personal enjoyment. But like theorists such as Kant, and I suppose Kant is the one that really focuses on this a lot. He said, for Kant, we want to separate the enjoyment of the work of art from its value aesthetically. So for him, I might look at a palace, and if I'm disgusted by rich excessive expenditures, I might think that the palace is off-putting, right? Someone says, what do you think about that palace? I might say, oh, look at all the money they wasted. All their, the king's peasants, they're all starving, and yet he's got this palace. It's disgusting. But for Kant, he's like, well, that's just your own personal gripe. You need to separate that from it. Just look at it as a work of art. Isn't it pretty, right? So that's sort of Kant's beef. But for Dewey, it's different, right? We want to separate our own personal enjoyment from it. That's fine. But if we're doing art theory and we want to understand why certain works of art, like the Parthenon, aren't just enjoyable to me, but they're somewhat recognized universally. It's become, as he says, by common consent, understood to be a great work of art. So what is it about this? And for him to understand that, why it appeals on such a wide level, we have to understand its attachment to actual experience. And in this case, particularly the experience of the Athenian citizens, who first were, I guess, the very first people to actually use the building for a purpose, for an actual civic purpose. The turning to them is as human beings who had needs that were a demand for the building and that were carried to fulfillment in it. It is not an examination such as might be carried on by a sociologist in search for material relevant to his purpose. The one who sets out to theorize about the aesthetic experience embodied in the Parthenon must realize in thought what the people into whose lives it entered had in common as creators and those who were satisfied with it, with people in our own homes and on our own streets. Okay. So sorry, I live in a noisy neighborhood. You might hear the drag racers driving by occasionally. So forgive me if that's distracting. But anyway, so back to the point at hand. We've got this question for Dewey is, and he thinks he can answer this when he looks at experience in general. But the question is, how can we relate? Okay, how can we relate this aesthetic? He's calling it an aesthetic experience of the Parthenon. How can we relate the aesthetic experience of the Parthenon by those Athenians who actually used it, right? In their governing of the city, right? And who built it as a sign of civic pride. How can we relate to that? And how can we find parallels to that, as he says, in our own homes and on our own streets? Okay, so this is the challenge. This is the task for a philosophy of art. And Dewey thinks he has the answer. We just have to look at experience in general, right? So for him, again, art is experience. In order to understand the aesthetic in its ultimate and approved forms, one must begin with it in the raw, in the events and scenes that hold the attentive eye and ear of man, arousing his interest and affording him enjoyment as he looks and listens. The sights that hold the crowd, the fire engine rushing by, the machines excavating enormous holes in the earth, the human fly climbing the steeple side, the men perched high in the air on girders, throwing and catching red-hot bolts. So these examples he's using here don't strike us as works of art, right? And I don't think he's trying to make that point. These are not works of art. When we hear a siren running by, when we see this powerful construction device, boring through earth, these grab our attention. They grab a hold of our attention. They somehow jump out at us from all other modes of experience, right? We sort of are, I hate to use this term, it's a psychological term, but there's a pattern interrupt, right? For those psychology majors, right? There's a pattern interrupt. So our brain sort of is going on this automatic pilot, and then all of a sudden we hear this loud ambulance driving by and the sirens distract us, right? It jumps out and holds our attention, right? That is the aesthetic experience. Far removed from, what Dewey calls these popular understandings and also the more esoteric understandings of art, right? Sort of popular understanding, art is just something to enjoy. It's just a diversion, or the esoteric understanding with the sort of the fine art, the museum understanding of arts, right? So, he seems to have quite a beef with this understanding, right, of art as this sort of separate, removed realm that's only understood by snobs and this and that. Dewey has his beef with it. I got to admit here, I put my cards on the table. I kind of with him on this to a certain extent. So he says, many a person who protests against the museum conception of art still shares the fallacy. So even so, he doesn't like it either, but he says one reason that people don't like it, it is also unfounded. He's got a good reason for not liking it. It's separated from experience. All these works are separated from their context. You go see Michelangelo's David today, and it's in a building that was built just for the work of art. They built the building around it, actually. It's such a huge statue. I guess it was cheaper for them to actually put it down and then build the building around the statue than building it and taking it through the door. So that's a perfect example, I think, of what Dewey is saying. It's wrong, right? Maybe leaving it in the town square where it was before, it was too precious to leave it to the elements. But now it no longer has, it's taken out of its context. For Dewey, it's not gonna, you might be able to have experience of that work, but it's not gonna be the same experience that it had in its original context. Okay, but back to the quote, right? So many people don't like this museum conception, but they still, as he says, they share this fallacy from which the conception springs. For the popular notion comes from a separation of art from the objects and scenes of ordinary experience that many theorists and critics pride themselves upon holding and even elaborating. The times when select and distinguished objects are closely connected with the products of usual vocations are the times when appreciation of the former is most rife and most keen. This, I kind of want to push back on that. What he's saying is that, certain works of art, like, he's going to get into this in a minute. We'll talk about it more, but I'll say some more about it. But he talks about how, you go to art museums sometimes today and you'll see, ancient art that's just pottery. It's works of art that were just used for practical purposes. You'll see a spear or a jug or something, right? And now they're in glass cases, and we look at them, we appreciate them aesthetically as works of art. But for him, he says that that's not as, as he put it, that these products, when they're distinguished from that, right, from these usual vocations, as he puts it, they lose that appreciation. And he thinks that time when they're actually used is when the appreciation of these objects is most rife and most keen. And I would beg to differ. I don't know, like, maybe this is true in some cases, but it seems to me like, imagine, like, do you think those pots that we look at in museums under glass cases, excuse me, do you think that those pots were treated as precious when they were made as they are now, that they're like thousands, hundreds of thousands of years old or whatever, right? I don't know. I don't think so. I don't know. But maybe what he's also saying is that they were appreciated in the right way. They weren't isolated from experience, right? And so they were properly aesthetic. They provided a smooth functioning, right? Once these devices were invented, once the bowl and the ceramic jar was invented, they allowed for a smoother mode of existence, a more aesthetic mode of existence. And so that's a more proper, perhaps for Dewey, that's a more proper notion of aesthetic, as opposed to this separation of art objects from all other things as these precious, different, special, only known by snobby intellectual people. This sort of, as like I said, this esoteric conception of art, which he rails against. Okay. So, and again, he brings up this point about these functional objects, right? Domestic utensils, furnishings of tent and house, rugs, mats, jars, pots, bows, spears. These were wrought with such delighted care that today we hunt them out and give them places of honor in our art museums. Yet in their own time and place, such things were enhancements of the processes of everyday life. Instead of being elevated to a niche apart, they belonged to display of prowess, the manifestation of group and clan membership, worship of gods, feasting and fasting, fighting, hunting, and all the rhythmic crises that punctuate the stream of living. Right, so for him, these objects that we have pictured here, right, these utensils, these aren't utensils, pots, pans, jars. For him, they added a certain rhythm to life. And they also were a sign of pride and craftsmanship amongst clans and this and that. So for him, in their original context, this is when they were truly art, supposedly, right? This is when they were truly aesthetic. So dancing and pantomime, so how does that apply to experience, right? What is the function of dancing and pantomime? Okay, this is something that maybe he's not super clear about, I gotta admit. So dancing, pantomime, the sources of the art of the theater flourished as parts of religious rites and celebrations. This sounds a lot like Nietzsche. I don't think Dewey would like that. Dewey is writing in the 1930s. He's writing this, and Nietzsche was pretty controversial back then. And to be fair to Nietzsche, I think he was widely misunderstood and associated with a highly anti-Semitic, sort of Nazi philosophy, which I don't think is fair to Nietzsche. And I think Dewey, if he heard me saying anything about him being anything like Nietzsche, he'd be pretty pissed off. But of course, I think that's his bias. But he's saying exactly what Nietzsche be saying in The Birth of Tragedy, right? That, when Nietzsche says about the Greek tragedies, that obviously these works of art weren't just these separate, esoteric. They were esoteric in the sense of like, yeah, the Dionysian rites were mysterious or whatever, but they weren't esoteric in the sense of like the general public at large wasn't completely alienated from any understanding of them. They weren't these institutions, that were kept separate from society, but they were a part, dancing, music, celebrations were a part of religious rites. They were a part of a communal type of experience. Musical art abounded in the fingering of the stretched string. Interesting that he mentions music first here, right? Again, I think that's quite akin to Nietzsche. I don't know if that was intentional or not, right? But, the musical art abounded in the fingering of the stretched string, the beating of the taut skin, the blowing with reeds. Even in the caves, human habitations were adorned with color pictures that kept alive to the senses with the animals that were so closely bound with the lives of humans. Structures that housed their gods and the instrumentalities that facilitated commerce with the higher powers were wrought with a special fineness. But the arts of the drama, music, painting, and architecture, thus exemplified, had no peculiar connection with theaters, galleries, museums. They were part of the significant life of an organized community. Right. So again, these artworks, let's skip that one almost. These artworks were not separate from other aspects of civic life. Right. For him, art was a part of civic life and ceremony. Painting and sculpture, he says, were organically one with architecture, as that was one with the social purpose that the building served, right? The Parthenon wasn't just a beautiful work of art to show off their architectural skill. It was also a symbol of Greek civic pride. Music and song were intimate parts of the rites and ceremonies in which the meaning of group life was consummated. Drama was a vital reenactment of the legends and history of group life. Not even in Athens can such arts be torn loose from this setting in direct experience and yet retain their significant character. Athletic sports, as well as drama, celebrated and enforced traditions of race and group, instructing the people, commemorating glories, and strengthening their civic pride. Right? We have here a photograph of a performance of this is the Mahabharata, which is it's a Hindu epic, right? That is usually performed every year. They'll do it as a part of the Diwali festival, right? And so this is something I think a good example of apparently when these stories were first written and they were first reenacted and performed, I think that someone like Nietzsche would point to them as very similar to that of Greek tragedy, the function that they serve in the community, right? That you couldn't really separate, and maybe even today you could argue this if you're a Hindu and you go see these plays during Diwali. If you're really a devout Hindu and you really get a lot out of them spiritually, then for Dewey, for Nietzsche, that is sort of the origin. That is why these works are great. It's not because they've been set aside and treated as great just by tradition and by authority and by some snob at an art museum, but because, again, they were a part of civic life and ceremony. And for Dewey, he says this explains, even though he doesn't agree with it completely, he says this attachment of art to life and to experience, he says, explains a bit why exactly some of the early Greeks equated art with imitation and repetition and reproduction, right? So he says, under such conditions, it's not surprising that the Athenian Greeks, here we have Plato, right, contemplating the forms, right? That's the mirror of a pomegranate, right? Art is just a reflection. It's imitation, right? It's a mirror of the world, and it's sort of for Plato, that's a bad thing. It's further removed from reality. But again, Dewey doesn't agree with this, but he thinks he sees why it's kind of intuitive to equate art with imitation or reproduction, and maybe for more for the reasons that Aristotle would. If you remember back to our Aristotle lectures, for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, you're not my class probably. We covered Aristotle in class at U of H, but Aristotle talks about how art is natural and we get joy out of it because humans are naturally imitative creatures. We learn by imitating our parents, our role models, and whatever, and this sort of thing. So for Dewey, this is intuitive, but even though he doesn't completely agree that art is imitation, right? Remember, for him, art is experience, or at least intensified experience. We'll get some more details later on that, but again, it's not surprising, he says, that they thought art was imitation. There are many objections to this conception, but the vogue of the theory is testimony to the close connection of the fine arts with daily life. The idea would not have occurred to anyone had art been remote from the interest of life. For the doctrine did not signify that art was a literal copying of things. Again, so he doesn't agree with it, but that it reflected the emotions and ideas that are associated with the chief institutions of social life. Right? So you can't separate the art from the social context. And so the idea of art for art's sake, which is really something more modern, right? You don't, that term, art pour l'art, right? That's how the French, they came up with this. I forgot the theorist, but art pour l'art, right? Art for art's sake. You just make art for its own sake. You're not trying to fulfill a civic function. That's crafts. That's, I have artist friends that they still share this snooty, stuck up, like they won't go see art shows if it's like an arts and crafts show, with vendors selling wares. That's beneath them, right? It has to be in a snooty art museum or art gallery with fine art and cheese, and everyone's just contemplating it intellectually, right? But Dewey says that notion, art for art's sake, would not even have made sense to the early Greeks. It wouldn't have been understood to the Greek theorist, okay? And there's historic reasons for this, as he points to, right? There must be historic reasons for the rise of the compartmental conception of fine art. Our present museums and galleries, to which works of art are removed and stored, illustrate some of the causes that have operated to segregate art instead of finding it an attendant of temple, forum, and other forms of associated life, right? Political life, communal life. An instructive history of modern art could be written in terms of the formation of the distinctively modern institutions of museum and exhibition gallery. There's actually, I have a book here. Let me see if I can find it real quick. It's kind of does what he says. It's called The Invention of Art. That's backwards, I forget. Yeah, but it's written by Larry Shiner. It's not exactly a page turner, but if you're an art history snob or nerd or whatever, I recommend it. You know, it's pretty interesting. It kind of talks about what Dewey is referring to here, right? The beginning of our modern conception of art as something completely removed from practicality. It's not has anything to do with civics, right? Like you're not painting a fresco for a church. You're not, you're doing it just because you're an artist, right? And so this has actually been done, right? So, of course, he's writing this in the 30s, and the Shiner text, I think, is from the 90s. Oh, 2001. I may point out a few outstanding facts. So he's going to give us his sort of short version of what he thinks happened, right? How is this more contemporary conception of art? How is it created, right? How did it emerge? He says most European art museums are, among other things, memorials of the rise of nationalism and imperialism. So those are two forces, global forces, the rise of the nation state, and, the imperialism that followed from that. So every capital must have its own museum of painting, sculpture, etc., devoted in part to exhibiting the greatness of its artistic past, and in other part to exhibiting the loot gathered by its monarchs in conquest of other nations, right? So the sort of imperialistic aspects, right? Napoleon wants to show off all his spoils in the Louvre. For him, these are examples that testify to the connection between this modern segregation of art and nationalism and militarism, right? So that's one factor, for Dewey that is going to be a big factor here. And I'm having trouble with my PowerPoint, so let me see what's going on here. Okay, it's back to working. Let's see if that works. Okay, let me escape and get back on track. We're almost done with this video here. Maybe 5 more minutes left, and we'll get to a good stopping point. Let me get back to sharing the screen, and let's get this going. Okay, here we go. So he admits, though, that there's some positive. I guess there's a sort of something good about this in a sense. You can point to a few examples, like he mentions in Japan that this sort of connection of art to nationality has helped preserve, for instance, the temples, the Shinto temples in Japan. They probably would have been destroyed if it weren't for their being nationalized, or they wouldn't at least been as well taken care of. But again, this is a price there's a price we pay for this. We're going to lose this deep significance of art as it is tied to our culture and our experience, our direct experience of life. So he writes that the growth of capitalism, again, so it's not just nationalism or imperialism, but also the growth of capitalism that has led to this new conception of art as something that's a niche, right? That's sort of separate and set apart from other aspects of society. So the growth of capitalism has been a powerful influence in the development of the museum as the proper home for works of art, and in the promotion of the idea that they are apart from common life. The nouveau riches, who are an important byproduct of the capitalist system, have felt especially bound to surround themselves with works of fine art, which, being rare, are also costly. Generally speaking, the typical collector is a typical capitalist. For evidence of good standing in the realm of higher culture, he amasses paintings, statuary, and artistic bijoux as his stocks and bonds certified his standing in the economic world, right? So these are just, one aspect. So we've got nationalism, we've got imperialism, we've also got these nouveau rich, you've got the sort of, Great Gatsby types who want to show off their wealth and show how successful they are, and the way they do this is through their art. Well, geez, this keeps freezing. Oh, now it isn't. Okay, I guess if I use my mouse, it works pretty fine. Again, we're almost done. We're coming to a good stopping point here, but to sort of finish this point and his argument, right? It's not merely individuals, but communities and nations. They put their cultural good taste in evidence by building opera houses, galleries, museums. These show that a community is not wholly absorbed in material wealth because it's willing to spend its gains in patronage to art. So it's a good thing in that regard, I think Dewey would say. Okay, he's not, I don't think he's criticizing that. It erects these buildings and collects their contents as it now builds a cathedral. These things reflect and establish superior cultural status, while their segregation from the common life reflects the fact that they are not a part of a native and spontaneous culture, right? Again, that's something that I don't think he likes about the modern conception of art. And I'm stuck on this slide. Here we go. All right. Another factor, right? We've only got a couple more slides to go, and then we'll give it up, okay? Industrialization, okay? Industrialization is a big factor, right? Another reason why we have this snooty museum conception of art. Because of the changes in industrial conditions, the artist has been pushed to one side from the main streams of active interest. Industry has been mechanized, and an artist cannot work mechanically for mass production. So previously, when you needed an artist to build your Parthenon or to paint your fresco for your museum, now you can get all this stuff done by some advertising firm, or even done by computer. Your designs can be computer generated. Somebody with no artistic talent can come up with a logo for their company. So artists, not completely. Obviously, there's a lot of professional artists who get their, make their living off commercial work. But it's strictly seen as something commercial. It's not seen as something beautiful and aesthetic, right? It says, I'm just doing this for the money kind of thing. And so this is another factor. So industrialization, because it's automated and mechanized, certain things that artists used to be necessary for, this has added even further to the segregation of art from normal everyday experience. So the artist, he says, is less integrated than formerly in the normal flow of social services. A peculiar aesthetic individualism results. And I, for one, I totally agree with Dewey on this. I don't want to dwell on this too much. I know the video is already getting long enough. But yeah, I find that modern art is very individualistic to the point of almost nauseous, right? It's just nauseous. It's like so autobiographical. It's like, dude, can't you say something that is going to strike a nerve with anybody else? I mean, are you just trying to, again, and this can be effective. I don't want to poo-poo on all art like this, but I think that almost it's taken sometimes to the point of absurdity. But Dewey writes about this, and I gotta say I agree with him to a large extent. He says artists find it incumbent upon them to betake themselves to their work as an isolated means of self-expression. In order not to cater to the trend of economic forces, they often feel obliged to exaggerate their separateness to the point of eccentricity. Consequently, artistic products take on a still greater degree the air of something independent and esoteric. So put the action of all these forces together, right? Nationalism, imperialism, industrialization, the rise of capitalism and the nouveau rich, put all that together, plus this new individualism in the artist separate from the normal flow of life. You put all that together, and this sort of seals the deal. This sort of segregates art, right? The conditions that create the gulf which exists generally between producer and consumer in modern society operate to create also a chasm between ordinary and aesthetic experience. And then, you know, we have our friends Schopenhauer and Kant, who don't help much either, right? Remember back to, you know, if you go to those lectures and you review your Schopenhauer and Kant, you know, for them, the proper way to experience a work of art is not like, you know, by getting all wrapped up in it and becoming a part of it and becoming one with it. I mean, well, I mean, I should probably be careful when I say that. I mean, in a certain sense, Schopenhauer would maybe say you do become one with everything. You lose your sense of self or whatever. But I think Dewey might actually say the opposite, right? That you become more yourself and you become more. You have more of a sense of purpose and identity. And so I think Dewey would probably put a lot of blame on these highly contemplative theories of art, which you know, kind of relegate all aesthetic experience to this purely, you know, highly intellectual realm. Like all proper aesthetic experience is detached and intellectual and contemplative, right? Dewey doesn't approve of this, right? So he says, finally, we have as the record of this chasm, accepted as if it were normal, the philosophies of art that locate art in a region inhabited by no other creature, and that emphasize beyond all reason the merely contemplative character of the aesthetic, right? And again, he does not approve of this, okay? And again, I think, you know, this is probably a good place to stop the video. We're about halfway through the first chapter. Again, we're spending a lot more time on this first chapter than we are on the next few chapters because it's such an important chapter. Chapter 2 is pretty important as well, but I think we can knock that out in one video. So anyway, thanks for joining me and sticking around to the end. I know it was a long one. I'll go ahead and stop it there, and I'm start uploading this to YouTube. But we'll try to get all these Dewey videos out by the end of the week. So by Friday, you should see the whole series. I'm hoping I can get it down to 8 or 9 videos, but it's looking like it might be pretty mammoth here. Again, there'll be a few videos that'll be skippable, and I'll let you know at the beginning. You know, you don't have to watch these unless you really want to get hardcore into Dewey. But again, thanks a lot for sticking around for this one, and I'll see you on the other side.